Hello, my name is Monica, and today we're going to be talking about cyberbullying. My presentation will first cover bullying as a general concept, and then we will talk more specifically about cyberbullying. The essential questions for this webinar will be by the end of the workshop. I hope I have answered all of them. The first question I'm going to answer is, why does bullying need our attention? Then I'm going to answer what bullying exactly is, and then I'm going to move into cyberbullying first, talking about what cyberbullying is, and then we're going to talk about some ways to prevent and deal with cyberbullying in general. So first, we're going to talk about why bullying needs our attention. I want to introduce the urgency of bullying by posting a few headlines of a few online newspapers that I encountered. These are all headlines that really reflect how bullying is an emergency and how bullying can lead to very catastrophic consequences. So these headlines I found from searching the word bullying and news on the internet, and these are some of the ones that I found. As you can see, this is a very big issue that leads to very serious consequences. About a year ago, more or less, in 2013, there was a very big study published on the effects of bullying and how they reflect in adulthood. So this is a small clip from the New York Times, who published a small summary of the study. But the study in general was published in a very important psychiatry journal, and they found that over a long period of time, the effects of bullying last into adulthood. So adults can have very big consequences that come or have an origin in bullying experiences in their childhood. So this study was published in 2013 and basically summarizes the long-term effects of bullying and how they reflect in adulthood. So some of these main effects that I found were the following. For the victims, it was seen that they are 4.3 times more likely to have anxiety disorders as adults. And for bullies, they were 4.1 times more likely to develop antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder is a diagnosis that people with very high-risk behaviors have. Sometimes these people usually end up in conflict with the law. So as you can see, these effects have an impact also on public health system and even in justice systems, because if we have people who were victims of bullying or bullies themselves, they will likely require services in adulthood that are very expensive and that are a big cost for society. So these two main findings I'm first introducing definitely lead us to think that investing in preventing bullying is also investing in cutting costs later on in public health and justice. So some effects that were found for both bullies and victims are the following. Both bullies and victims are 14.5 times more likely to develop panic attacks as adults. This is a very interesting finding because it applies for both bullies and victims, and the times that this is more likely to happen is pretty high, 14.5. They are also 4.8 times more likely to suffer from depression, 18.5 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, and 26.7 times more likely to suffer from agoraphobia in women. Agoraphobia is fear of being in very open spaces or crowded spaces. So as you can see, a lot of the effects that happen in adulthood are big public health, mental health issues. They require a lot of treatment, and this treatment is usually very expensive. So this leads us to think that the effects are not only on the people themselves, but also on the costs that the state has to invest in public health to deal with these people later on in life when they have these issues. So as you can see, bullying is definitely something very urgent, but the positive thing is that bullying is a learned behavior. So if bullying can be learned, it can be examined and it can be corrected. Bullying is not something that we are born learning how to do. It's something that we do later on in life because we learn it and use it as a strategy to deal with issues that we have in our daily social lives. So if we know that this is something that we learn, we can examine it and we can correct it. So what exactly is bullying? I'm going to define what bullying is. It's very important to have a very clear definition of what bullying is, because a lot of people use the word bullying in a very indiscriminate manner. Bullying is not anything that has to do with social conflict between two students. For example, a lot of people think that any type of conflict that occurs between two students is automatically bullying, and it's not. So it's very important to have a very clear definition of what bullying is in order to define what bullying is not. Why is it important to make this differentiation? The way that we would deal with bullying is very different than the way we would deal with regular conflicts between students or kids or adolescents in general. So this is a very important term to define. So we need to first define what bullying is in order to be able to understand that it's not any conflict that happens between two students. Bullying can be defined as a hostile activity carried out in a conscious, intentional, and deliberate manner with the purpose of hurting, terrorizing, or causing fear through the threat of future aggression. So let's tear this down into parts. It's not something that we do when we're defending ourselves, when we're defending ourselves, because it's something that happens with the purpose of hurting or terrorizing or causing fear to another person. So when we defend ourselves from a situation, we're protecting ourselves. We're not necessarily wanting to hurt, terrorize, or the person without any other justification. It's something that happens in a conscious, intentional, and deliberate manner. So there's an element of planning behind this. It's something that is done in a conscious manner, it's planned, and has only one purpose: hurting, terrorizing, or causing fear. There's always the threat of future aggression. So the person who bullies is somebody who actually makes it clear that whatever happens can happen again and will probably happen again. So the element of threat of something happening further on is definitely something that needs to be included in a situation for it to be labeled a bullying situation. So there's 4 components in bullying that need to be in a way covered or that need to happen in order to label a situation as a bullying situation. The first thing that needs to happen is that there needs to be an unbalance of power. One person automatically has to have more power than the other. The bully usually always is the one that has more power. What defines what power is? Pretty much anything. It can be better grades, higher social economic position. It can be a certain physical characteristic or anything that puts this person in a situation of recognition and power. There also needs to be the intention of hurting. We discussed this in the previous slide. When we have bullying, there needs to be the intention of making somebody else suffer. That automatically leaves out self-defense as a way of bullying. And there also needs to be the threat of a future aggression. We discussed this in the previous slide too. There needs to be the threat that whatever happened in that situation can happen again, and thus the victim is always scared because this can repeat itself. The 4th component is something that happens not at the very beginning of the situation, but starts happening later on as situations keep on repeating themselves, and this is the element of terror. The victim is feeling a lot of terror, and the bully is creating a lot of terror in the victim because of this repetitive system where the bully will continue to repeat situations that will put the victim in a very difficult position. There's 3 types of bullying that 3 main types of bullying that are very important to discuss. Some of these are more common in girls, some of these are more common in boys. The first one is verbal bullying. This is more or less equally common in both boys and girls. Verbal bullying refers to those situations where kids are called names, they're made fun of, gossip is spread out regarding somebody, and these are the more common situations of bullying, where people are labeled, they're called nicknames or or bad things, and they're hurt in a verbal manner, either by oral or written form. We have physical bullying as well. This is more common in boys, but it can also happen in girls. And this is something, this type of bullying is very interesting because it is much more visible. So it happens in places where there is very little supervision, because it's more obvious that it's happening. People who tend to do physical bullying or to engage in physical bullying usually are the bullies that have a worse outcome because they are not capable of feeling guilt when they see the effects of their actions on the bully. In verbal bullying, we don't necessarily know how bad the person is feeling, but if I hit somebody and then I see how bad the person is hurt and I can still continue doing that, then that means I'm a person who is very, very callous and emotional, who does not have the ability to detect suffering in other people and thus regulate their emotions because of that. And then we have relational bullying. Relational bullying is much more common in girls. It increases as we age, and this is a type of bullying where people are excluded on purpose from different social groups or social activities. It's very common in girls, as I mentioned. And this tends to happen more or less entering adolescence in a much more frequent manner. So bullying can be compared to a tragedy of three characters. There's three main characters. So far, I have only mentioned two. We have the bully, and we have the victim, and we have a third character who is actually one of the most important characters because this third character can stop or actually promote a bullying situation. So I'm going to be talking about this third character in detail after I describe the bully and then I describe the victim. Before I start describing these characters, I want to give a few words of warning. The first thing that I want to say is that the roles are flexible and kids can play them in a simultaneous manner. So, for example, I can be a bully at the school bus, but then at the school I'm not necessarily a bully. So these are flexible roles. It's not like you only play one role. You can't assign a person a fixed role. If I assign a role to a person and I label somebody as the bully or the victim, then I'm not letting any room for improvement. I'm automatically putting them in a box. And the idea is that we promote people to get rid of these labels and actually find new roles. So it's not fair to assign a person a fixed role. As I mentioned, avoiding labeling is very important because that way if we label, we don't allow for a lot of change. So by getting rid of labels and not labeling somebody as a bully, we're actually giving them a chance to be something else that's not the bully or the victim. When we use these words or label somebody as the bully, the victim, we're labeling a person, and that's actually a little extreme. We need to focus on the behavior and not on the person. So labeling somebody as a bully would be labeling the person. We need to label the behavior and not the person. I'm going to use these labels, and I've been using these labels for speed and time purposes. So I'm going to be talking about the victim, the bully, the bystander, who is our third character. But the idea is that you don't use these labels in such a simplistic manner. The idea is that you understand that there's several roles, but they are not fixed, and it's not good to label anybody with these words. So first, I'm going to talk about the bully. The bully acts as a group many times, probably most of the time, depending on the context. Why does this happen? As you remember, one of the components of bullying is the power issue. There's definitely more power for the bully and less power for the victim. The group, acting as a group, empowers kids. So when we have a group situation, there's definitely more power. It usually happens that a big group of people hurt one single person. So that automatically creates the unbalance of power. The bully usually likes to dominate others. Research has led us to think that bullies tend to be very dominant people that want to dominate others. They also have a hard time with empathy. This is very interesting, and this is not something that I came up with. This is something that comes from research. The bully has a very hard time understanding how others can feel with their actions. So this is why a bully can see that a victim is actually hurt and continue doing this once and once again with an intentional manner. So if the bully were more connected with other people's feelings and would be able to feel more empathy, probably the reaction that he or she would observe on the victim would regulate his or her behavior and stop any future acts. Bullies usually have very little regard for other people's feelings. This is connected to the lack of empathy that they usually have towards other people's. Bullies usually act when there is no figure of authority. This is very important. Bullies need to feel like they have the power, that they dominate the situation. If there is an authority figure there that is supervising the situation, it's very hard for this person to have the power that he or she needs to engage in this type of behavior. So usually the bully does not act when there is an authority figure, because in that situation he or she would not be the one with the power. This is why bullying usually happens in places like bathrooms, for example, at school, or on the bus, or in places where there's usually not a lot of supervision. So this is very important to keep in mind. Having an authority figure present automatically diminishes the possibilities of bullying behavior. Bullies usually don't take responsibility for their acts. They actually never take the blame, or usually don't take the blame, and this is because they have a very hard time feeling guilty. If they would have an easy time, or the ability to feel guilt in a higher manner, they would probably regulate their behavior much more and would not engage in bullying activities as often. They also like to get attention. They are people who usually want to feel like they are important, that they have power, and that they dominate. So they tend to be attention seekers. Bullies usually have a hard time anticipating the future as well. A bully usually has a hard time because if they would be able to anticipate the future, they would probably regulate their behavior depending on what they would anticipate. They can't anticipate that their actions are going to have such a strong effect on somebody else, and therefore they continue doing them because they don't see them as something that can really get them or other people in a hard situation, in a difficult situation. The victim is a very interesting role, because the victim can be whoever is the new kid, whoever prefers to solve issues without fighting, whoever has more money or less money than the rest, whoever wears glasses, has a different religion, uses braces, whatever else we can think of that puts in a person in a situation of being inferior. So we can see that victims are usually people that are made feel less than they actually are because of a characteristic that they can have. So whatever puts the victim in the position of the victim, in the situation of less power, is a characteristic defined mostly by the social context. So in some places, being of a different religion can put them in a situation of a disadvantage. So, or in other places, being the new kid is actually something that means you have less power. So this depends a lot on the conflict, but basically the victim can be anybody who has a characteristic that puts them in a situation where they don't have as much power as others in their group. Victims usually have a very hard time asking for help. They usually are afraid to ask for help and do ask for help in ways that are not necessarily very clear. They are usually very afraid of being hurt, and this makes them sometimes rethink asking for help. They are very fearful that they will get hurt even more because they talk to somebody else. So a lot of the times when you talk to a victim and ask them, why didn't you ask for help? He or she can say, I was afraid of this getting me into more trouble. So usually they are afraid to ask for help because this can put them in a worse situation. Maybe sometimes they have tried to get help, but it did not work at all. So it's very important to, as adults, to be aware that whenever a victim asks for help, even if it's not very evident, we really need to pay attention, because maybe this can be the only time that they are empowered and that they ask for help, and then if we don't react or do anything about it, maybe they will think it didn't work and not do it again. So this is very common, that they try to ask for help and they don't get it, so they don't try again. A lot of the time, the victim thinks it's very normal to go through a bullying situation. So a lot of the times, if you talk to them, they can say, this is normal, this is a part of growing up, boys will always be boys, and boys will always bother each other and bully each other, and they tend to normalize the situation as a defense mechanism. So a lot of the times, they might think that what's going on with them is something that they have to go through, or that is a part of growing up. They usually ask for help in very strange ways. It's not very evident when they ask for help. Some of them might let us know that something's going wrong when they lower their grades, or they stop eating, or they're afraid to go to school, or they stop using their computer, or they don't want to socialize anymore. So a lot of the time, some of these changes in a person's activity level or in how they usually act can lead us to think that something is not right, and sometimes a bullying situation can be behind all of this. Okay, the bystander is a very important character, and it's the third character we're going to talk about. The bystander is one of the characters that we tend to forget, because we usually think about the bully or the victim. There is no innocent bystander. Why? Because bystanders are witnesses of a bullying situation, and whenever you witness something like this, you need to take action. If not, you won't be innocent. You'll actually be encouraging the situation. So bystanders are very important because they can stop the situation or they can escalate the situation. They have a lot of power. They can either become people who protect the victim, or they can actually become bullies. They are usually more than one, and they witness several events, so they are used to observing these situations. And there's several types of bystanders. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a scale where we're going to locate the different types of bystanders and how they can turn to one side or the other, to the side of the bully or to the side of the victim. On one end of the scale, we have the bully, who is whoever opens the act, and then following the bully, we have what we would call the followers. They usually start as bystanders, but then turn into bullies, because at first they don't start the situation, but eventually they join and continue the situation. So these are bystanders that turn into bullies. Then we have supporters, who are those who support the act but don't participate. So these people don't end up being bullies, but they stay as bystanders who don't cooperate and actually, in a way, protect the bully and continue the situation. Then we have those who offer passive support. These people approve of the act but don't support it openly. We have uninterested bystanders, who are more or less neutral, who watch but think this is none of my business. So these are those bystanders who either can tip to one end of the scale or to the other end of the scale, but some of them remain neutral, and the idea is that we tip them towards this side of the scale that I'm going to talk about now. We have on this side of the scale the possible defenses, who are those who don't approve of the act and think that they should do something, but they don't. So these are bystanders that are very interesting because they think that what's going on should not happen, but they don't want to take any action. These are easily converted into actual defenses if they're taught how to deal with situations where they're bystanders and how to actually act and protect the victim. Then we have those who we call the defenses. They don't approve of the act and they actually defend the victim. So these people actually start off as bystanders but eventually turn into characters that can stop the bullying situation. And on the final end of the scale, we will have the victim, who is hurt and can't protect herself or himself. So as you can see, we can put the bystanders in between the bully and the victim, and what we would ideally have is all of the bystanders turn into defenses and not into followers. The bystander has a very important role because they can either turn to one side or the other. They can escalate the conflict or they can actually stop it. So as you can see, the supporters, passive supporters, uninterested bystanders, possible defenses, are all bystanders that can turn to one end or the other. What is cyberbullying? Now we're going to focus specifically on bullying in cyberspace. So the definition of cyberbullying is bullying that takes place using electronic technology. So any type of bullying that occurs either with computers, tablets, smartphones, cell phones, or whatever type of technology would be considered cyberbullying. Why do we have a separate term for cyberbullying? Why can't we just call it bullying? Cyberbullying has several characteristics that are very unique and very important. Okay, before moving further on into cyberbullying, I think it's important that I give you a warning. Technology by itself isn't necessarily harmful. Technology is something that is very positive and can be used in ways that actually are very powerful and can positively impact a student's learning and their social life and their life in general. However, the problem is how it is used. So technology is not what we should censor, it's how it's used. The technology is not the problem, but the use that we give it can be. First, cyberbullying takes place 24/7. It happens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or it can happen 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It can stop because physical or verbal bullying or relational bullying, face-to-face or at school or in the bus or wherever else, stops whenever the victim and the bully are not in the same place. But cyberbullying can happen anytime, anywhere, all the time. Bystanders are not always present with the victim. This is very important to consider since bystanders have a very important role, like we discussed. So if they're not always present with the victim, then it's very hard for them to defend the victim. It's very hard to supervise. You can have some level of supervision, but it's very hard to be on top of every single thing that goes on in cyberspace with your children or your students. There's also the element of anonymity. This makes cyberbullying a very big issue because we can't really figure out who necessarily is the bully if there is the element of anonymity. It's very hard to get rid of any evidence. If a person, for example, is bullied and a picture is posted online, then this evidence can multiply itself very fast, and therefore it's very hard to get rid of any evidence that has been posted or of the picture in general, for example. It's very hard to track down its origin. Since this is something that happens in cyberspace and there's the element of anonymity, it's very hard to track down the origin of the bullying or the bully itself. Online information multiplies itself exponentially, so any information put on the web that is put there with the intention of hurting somebody else can travel very fast, and anybody can have access to this in a matter of seconds. So if I were to post a video, for example, making fun of somebody else on a video website online, in 5-10 minutes I can have 1,000 views. It's very easy to do so. I'm going to list a few examples of cyberbullying, so you get a better idea of what cyberbullying actually is. First, we have a situation of a girl who creates a fake profile of a classmate and uploads embarrassing photos. So using photo editing software, you can actually take somebody's face, put it on another photo and make it an embarrassing photo, or you can have access to embarrassing photos of a person and then put them online and create fake profiles using these pictures. This is something that is done with the intention of hurting somebody else, and it can be done in a repetitive manner with the threat of this getting bigger. So it's definitely a bullying situation, cyberbullying situation. Another example, a boy receives anonymous text messages making fun of his appearance. The boy constantly gets messages from an unknown phone number or a phone number that doesn't seem to have an owner that the person can track down, making fun of how he looks. This is definitely a situation of verbal bullying that goes on in cyberspace because it happens through a phone. It happens with text messages. We can have another example. A girl receives an invitation to chat with an unknown person, and she shares personal information and photos that are later shared on a public blog. So a girl is online, she is chatting with somebody who she thinks she knows who it is, or maybe she doesn't know who it is, and she still continues to share personal information or photos, and then these photos are put on a public blog without her consent, and everybody has access to these. So as you can see, there's many different ways of bullying somebody in cyberspace, and the common denominator is that all of this happens with electronic technology. So as you can see, some of these examples use different ways of technology, and the effects can be very destructive, especially because anything that happens online can be multiplied in an exponential manner very easily. Imagine, for example, looking at the last example I cited, this public blog being distributed, or the link to this public blog being shared with everybody in the school. In a matter of seconds, everybody can have access to the personal information and photos that this girl shared with this person on the chat. A few statistics. These are statistics from the United States. It's a country that has a lot of good research and a lot of statistics on what goes on in cyberspace and bullying situations in cyberspace. Not every country has a lot of statistics, but I think that these are very significant and worth sharing. So the National Center for Education Statistics and the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the United States in 2009 carried out a study where they found out that 6% of students in grades 6 to 12 in middle school and high school report having been victims of cyberbullying. So 6 out of 100 students, more or less, report having been victims during more or less they're starting at 12 years old until 18 years old, more or less. In grades 9 through 12, things are a little different, because if we just look at people from 9 to 12th grade, the amount of cyberbullying and the victims of cyberbullying increases. So 16% of high school students grades 9 through 12 have been victims of cyberbullying. So as you can see, cyberbullying tends to increase with age. It's definitely more common to be a victim of cyberbullying when you are older than when you are younger. Research, however, is very difficult to carry out because of the constant change in technology and its use. We can definitely see how there is a big issue with collecting data or gathering data, because technology is changing so fast, and the sites that kids are accessing are changing very fast. So it's very hard to actually develop a very thorough study on cyberbullying because of the constant change. But we have a few statistics, and this is definitely an issue that we need to discuss. Why is it more common in the upper grades? Why is cyberbullying more common as you grow older into high school? There's an explanation for this. Cyberbullying requires a certain level of complexity. You need to have certain skills that allow you to develop things that are very complex. For example, a third grader can't probably develop a blog in such a way that a ninth grader can. Or a second grader doesn't have the ability to create an anonymous profile or an anonymous identity online like somebody else would. So cyberbullying requires much more skill and requires much more access to technology. And usually people in these grades have more access to a lot of different websites, a lot of different strategies. So it's much more common to see this happen in the upper grades. Some of the main effects of cyberbullying, some are similar. The effects of bullying in general apply to cyberbullying, but there's some that have been found to be a little bit more specific to cyberbullying. For victims, they're more likely to use alcohol and drugs. They are more likely to skip school, and they are more likely to be victims of of regular bullying, face-to-face bullying. So something happens in cyberspace, and this will definitely make them more prone to suffer from a bullying situation at school or in the bus or at the party or at somebody else's home or in their neighborhood, for example. So we can see that victims of cyberbullying are also more prone to be victims of face-to-face regular classic bullying. They usually try to escape school, and they tend to have low academic achievement and higher mental and physical problems. So we can see that some of these effects are very serious. They deal with academic involvement as well. So this is definitely a problem that, even though it does not happen necessarily in the school, reflects on the school, not only socially but also academically. So these effects are important as well to consider from the school perspective. So we're going to talk about some ways to prevent and deal with cyberbullying in general. And we're going to start with prevention. We're going to talk about what can be done to prevent cyberbullying from happening. The first important thing that needs to happen in order to prevent cyberbullying is to have a good communication system between the school and the home. Why is this? Cyberbullying happens anywhere. It happens in cyberspace. It can happen in any geographical location. The only thing that needs to be happening is that there needs to be a device involved. So it's very hard to track down and supervise the use of this technology. So if there is a big communication channel between the school and the home, it's easier to keep track of what goes on in cyberspace. Schools usually have a hard time with cyberbullying because it's not something that happens directly at school, so they are not necessarily as involved as they would with a bullying situation that happens in the playground or in the classroom or in the bus or in the bathroom. But schools are also a place where the effects of cyberbullying are manifested. So definitely schools need to be involved in keeping a constant communication system with the home to prevent the lack of supervision from happening and having more control over what students are doing in cyberspace. The second thing that is very important is to set clear rules on the use of technology and to set an example. It's very important to have certain times for the use of technology and certain limits. It's not good for somebody to be online for 12, 13, 14 hours a day. There needs to be a time limit. By limiting the time that somebody is in the computer, we are not going to get rid of cyberbullying, but at least we're going to have a little bit more control. It's also very important to set space rules, not only physical spaces, but also virtual spaces, rules about virtual spaces. We need to make sure that our kids know in which spaces accessing technology is something that can be done. For example, maybe at a public computer, it's not a good idea to do things online because your information can become public and it can be used against you. So maybe you can set rules on where people can access technology and where they can't. It's also very important to define what virtual spaces can be accessed and which virtual spaces cannot. Some of these spaces are very dangerous or they have very low privacy settings, so it's better that we set rules on which of these spaces are accessible to our kids and students and which spaces are not. And we also need to warn them about risk situations and set rules about how these risk situations will be handled. If there is any suspicion that something risky is going on, then certain steps need to be taken. We're going to talk about that later, and we need to set rules about those steps with our children and our students. It's very important, as I mentioned before, to set an example as adults. If you don't want your children to be overusing technology or sharing more than enough information online, then you also have to set an example and not show or disclose public information that you wouldn't want your children to disclose. So you need to set an example as well. Number 3, it's very, very important that you follow the websites or the program, the online program's rules and policies. Most of the time we just skim through these policies and usually just accept them without reading them, but usually these policies or all of the time. These policies have very important information regarding privacy, for example, and a lot of the times these policies also mention for who this program or website is accessible to and for who it isn't. If we read that, for example, a certain website or a certain social media website or program is accessible only for children above 13, for example, if we have a 12 or 11-year-old who wants to access this, we shouldn't allow this to happen, because there's programs, rules, and website rules. And if we don't respect these, we're teaching our children that we can create our own rules and follow whatever is convenient for us and whatever is not. And that is not a very good lesson to teach a kid. We need to have them respect the rules and policies of these websites and programs. Number 4, it's very, very important to monitor the use of technology and how our children are using this technology. In order to do this, we need to learn to use you need to learn to use what your children use. If you see that your children are using a certain app or accessing a certain site or whatever, you need to be able to understand how this works, because it's the only way that you're going to be able to actually monitor the use of technology. Sometimes for adults, it's really hard to keep up with the activity that students have or children have online, because technology is something that is easier usually for people who are a little bit younger, but I think it's very important that adults make an effort to learn how to use what their children are using for the purpose of being able to monitor what's going on online. It's very important to get to know how your children use technology, what websites they visit, and how they interact in cyberspace. You need to be aware of what they're doing online, what they're visiting, and how they're interacting in cyberspace. This is one of the most important things I can recommend, because it's the only way that you'll be sure that you're actually monitoring how they are being or interacting online. It's very important to friend or follow your children in social media. This is something very tricky, because some children don't want their parents following them or friending them, but it has to happen in order for you to be able to monitor what's going on in cyberspace. The idea of friending or following one of your children online is not with the purpose of stalking them or controlling their lives or limiting their personal social lives, but with the purpose of being able to detect risks. So it's very important to talk this out with your child and let them know that you're doing this not to be somebody that is being intrusive, but actually to protect them and to be able to monitor how they're being projected in cyberspace. Number 5, in case of any risk, or not even with an evident risk, but with any suspicion of a risk being happening, parents have control of whatever device that the children have. So if I am slightly suspicious that something is going on that can be dangerous for somebody else or for my child, I automatically have control of the device. This is something that needs to be talked to with your children beforehand, so they know that if they are at any risk or they have any suspicion, or parents have any suspicion of there being a risk, automatically parents have control of the device, because they have the responsibility to protect their children. This is a rule that a lot of children will not appreciate, but it is a very important rule. It's very important to ask for passwords of these sites, but only use them for emergency only. You need to keep your word, because if not, you'll engage in a very big conflict with your child, and you will probably lose their trust if you're not just using this for an emergency situation. You might be tempted to use your child's passwords to kind of snoop into what they have to, what they're doing with their friends, but you have to be very respectful. You can't do this, because you're gonna lose their trust. But it's very important that you have their passwords, because there can be a very risky situation that you might need to engage yourself in, and if you don't have the access to their passwords, you're not going to be able to control what's going on. So passwords are important, but you need to warn your children that you'll use them for emergency only, and keep your word. Number 6, promote open channels of communication so your children will talk if involved in any situation. We know for a fact, and backed by research that victims are not prone to ask for help. And if they do, they're pretty unclear about how they're asking for help. So we need to make sure that our children feel that they can talk to us if they are involved in any situation. We need to keep open channels of communication with them. So that way, whenever something happens, they will reach out and have confidence that we will handle the issue in the appropriate way and actually help them and not put them in a worse situation. Number 7, it's very important to educate our children on the good use of technology. This is the best way to prevent things from going wrong in cyberspace. Your online identity should be protected. Your children's online identity should always be protected as well. So we need to make children aware of what can and what cannot be shared online and how to set privacy controls. A lot of times children tend to be a little bit more naive because they haven't lived through a lot of situations where they're put at risk. So we need to make sure that they understand what things they can share and what they can't. A lot of the times they don't always understand the privacy controls in some of these websites or apps or online sites. So we need to be sure that they understand that there's privacy controls that they need to set. And sometimes maybe they won't like setting a lot of these privacy controls, but it is definitely something that needs to happen in order to protect their identity and prevent something very bad from happening. You need to educate your children that once you share something online, you lose absolute control over it. So think before you act. You need to actually think before uploading something on the net. I can upload a picture and a second later decide to delete it, and for that second that picture was online, I lost absolute control over who owned that picture. A lot of people can access this picture, even people who are not maybe followers on my site, and they can somebody can take a screenshot of the picture, put it on their email, and then share it with a whole bunch of people. So you really need to be aware that whatever you post online, even if it's just for a second, you lose absolute control over it. So you really need to think before you act. Maybe a good idea would be to ask your children to show you what they're going to upload before they do, for maybe a couple of times, so you make sure that they understand what is acceptable and what is not. Another thing that is very important to warn your children about is that passwords should never be shared, not even with your best friend and not even as an act of loyalty. You should never share your password with any friends or anybody unless these people are your parents and they're going to have the password only for the purpose of protecting you in any risky situation. But passwords should never be shared, and online profiles should never be group profiles. Some students or children decide that they are going to create a joint profile, and this is never a good idea because you're not going to have absolute control over this. You're going to be sharing it with somebody else. Now we're going to talk about the dealing part of this. How do we deal with acts of cyberbullying? The way that we deal with these situations, it varies a little from the way that we will deal with regular bullying situations. The immediate steps that you should take when you find out that your child is engaged in a bullying situation or in a cyberbullying situation are the following. The first thing you need to do is you cannot reply or forward any cyberbullying messages. This is only going to make the situation worse. So don't reply or forward these messages. Also, it's very important to keep any evidence that you have. Why? Eventually, you may need to even press charges depending on what's going on and how old the person who is being the cyberbully is. So you really need to have all of the evidence that you can. You need to take screenshots, you need to write down times, emails, messages, etc. because you will probably need this evidence later on. Immediately, you should block the cyberbully to prevent anything from going on again. And you need to talk to your child about the next step that you will take and listen to his or her concerns. You need to warn your child about the steps that you're about to take because maybe they won't agree with what you're going to do. You need to act. You have a responsibility to act, but you need to act in a way that your child feels safe and does not feel exposed to something bigger happening. So you need to talk to your child and listen to his or her concerns so you act in the most appropriate manner. It's also very important to report cyberbullying to online service providers. So if something is going on and cyberbullying is taking place, you first need to reread the terms and conditions for the websites and internet service providers you use. Why? Because if you read the terms and conditions, you might find out that one of these was broken, one of these terms or conditions, and you might need to file for a report with the online service providers. You also need to set privacy settings to protect the victim. So maybe your child, if your child is engaged in a cyberbullying situation, has a little bit more information than he or she should online. So you need to set privacy settings so this information is not accessible to everybody. Ideally, we would prevent this, but in case we are in a situation where something private is exposed, we need to set privacy settings from preventing further situations to occur. We also need to report what happened to the website, especially if the terms and conditions were broken. This is very easy to do usually, and websites usually have a responsibility to act after receiving a valid report. Sometimes you might need to take legal action, and this is very important to go through because there are situations where you have the responsibility to actually take legal action. You should take legal action if cyberbullying includes the following: any threats of violence, stalking and hate crimes, child pornography, or sexually explicit messages or photos. If any of these happens, you have the responsibility to take legal action to protect your child. The legal context depends on the country, but there's usually a lot of legislation that protects children from being in situations where there's violence, stalking, hate crimes, child pornography, or sexually explicit messages or photos about them. So sometimes legal action is going to be necessary, and you need to act and take legal action. Another important thing to do when you are dealing with a bullying situation, a cyberbullying situation, you need to talk to the school. Why is this? We know that when there's cyberbullying, there usually will be face-to-face bullying. So if we talk to the school, we can prevent face-to-face bullying from going on, because that way the school will be more available for the victim and protect the victim in case that there is something going on in cyberspace. So talk to the school, let them know about what's going on. Schools can offer a lot of supervision on how the victim and the bully are interacting, and also can offer supervision of how technology is used. The school is not responsible 100% for what happens outside the school, but they can supervise how technology in the school is used to prevent cyberbullying from occurring from any school computers or personal computers used in the school. Schools also have a very big opportunity, and they can offer digital citizenship education to their students by educating their students on how to be digital citizens and how to use online content or online websites or technology in general in a proper way will be preventing cyberbullying from going on. Nowadays, we are citizens not only in our day-to-day situations, face-to-face situations, but we're also citizens online, and we need to use technology in a wise manner, and schools have a very big opportunity to educate children on how to be digital citizens. Sometimes it might be necessary to ask for professional help. This is very important. Sometimes the bullying or cyberbullying situation can be so big that professional help will be needed. So when necessary, it's very important to call somebody that can help out, because we don't want the effects of the cyberbullying situation to turn into something even more serious. Professional help is not only necessary sometimes for the victim, but also for the bully. Sometimes we tend to think that only victims need help, but bullies also need help. They need somebody to help them disengage and not be engaged in that type of dangerous behavior. So bullies also need professional help sometimes. So as a parent, you need to be aware that sometimes you might need somebody to help you out, and the school should also be aware that sometimes they need to make a referral when the situation is out of hand and that is it's growing and becoming worse, and the effects are going to be very big. By getting professional help, we're going to be avoiding a lot of the long-term consequences that we talked about in the beginning from the study that I mentioned. So thank you very much. This was a first introduction to cyberbullying, and I hope that the recommendations for how to prevent it and how to deal with it are going to be followed in your home to have more happy, safe children at home. Thank you. Hacemos preguntas.